Okay, this case study is looking at F581 specimen paper. The title states the market is the oil market. Oil prices up as winter weather hits the US, and it's also telling you an effect on the market there of weather. It says at the end of a year in which oil prices have reached record highs, so you know that the price is rising in the market. Prices have once again surged past the $60 a barrel mark. This time the price rise was a result of snowstorms battering the northeastern states of America, which in turn caused American households to use more oil in heating their homes. So there's a key part here which is talking about an increase in demand based on the weather. Over the past 2 years, the rise in oil prices has been attributed to two main factors. Firstly, global economic expansion has led to substantial rises in demand for oil, especially from countries such as America and China. So that is economic growth increasing, which is increasing incomes, and that is increasing the demand. So it's essentially saying that oil is a normal good, and that as incomes rise, demand rises. Second, violence and instability in countries such as Iraq has threatened oil production and reduced supply of oil in world markets. So one reason there, which is war and instability in oil producing countries, reducing supply. This factor has been worsened by natural disasters. So again, supply shocks such as weather. It says Hurricane Katrina in 2005 significantly reduced oil production in America. So both of those are indicating that supply is falling. It then goes on to say the impact of higher oil prices is much debated. Economists are concerned that higher oil prices will raise prices throughout the economy and lower world economic growth. So it's stating that there's an opportunity cost there, that if demand stays the same for oil, then money can't be spent on other goods and services. In contrast, environmentalists see the higher oil prices as actually doing some good. They claim that by raising petrol prices, motorists will be forced to make fewer journeys, and therefore the resulting negative externalities will be reduced. So the higher prices has the same effect as taxes, reducing the quantity demanded within the markets. It then goes on to say, yet this claim is much disputed. Many economists would point out that highly price inelastic demand for petrol means this would not occur. So inelastic demand, consumers would be unresponsive and the quantity demanded wouldn't fall much. Furthermore, as Table 1 shows, the actual production costs of petrol, which include the cost of crude oil itself, is only a small part of the overall price which is charged to motorists. So it's saying that the cost of the raw materials within the final cost is only small, which is charged to motorists. In addition, the small number of firms that dominate the petrol market are extremely wary of raising prices in case they lose sales to large rivals. As A2 students, you will know that this is kind of like an oligopoly market, in that price rises will not be followed, and price falls potentially will be. So they don't want to lose market share to their rivals. The last paragraph says, what is certain is that the government will continue to watch world oil prices very carefully. As the fuel protests of September 2000 showed, voters don't take kindly to having to pay more for their petrol. The figure at the bottom here just shows the price of 90 pence of fuel, how it is made up. You have 47 pence, roughly about 50% of it is made up of the tax, and A2, we know that this is fuel duty. You've got then only 25%, which is the cost of the raw material of crude oil. You've got 13.4 pence, which is 15% VAT, which is what it used to be, and then you've got delivery transportation costs at 8%. So that's important for looking at the price of fuel. If we look at the questions, first question, describe what is meant by the economic problem. That question is the same as if that said basic economic problem. So again, you're looking at scarce resources and how those are satisfied in relation to unlimited wants and needs. 2 marks, 2 key parts to that question. using the information provided, explain how the economic problem can be applied to the case of oil. So what you're looking for is why oil is potentially scarce. You can talk about it in terms of it being a finite resource, that it is unsustainable or unrenewable. You could also talk about the fact that there is lowered production in the case study. In terms of wants and needs, it mentions the use of it in terms of petrol and in terms of heating homes in America. You could probably argue that those are needs rather than wants. Next, there is a question around supply and demand. So it references lines 5 to 11, explains some of the reasons why world oil prices have increased in recent years, using diagrams. So at least two show how world oil prices have been affected by the following: global economic expansion and global growth in countries such as China, and the impact of natural disasters. Both of those are worth 3 marks. You're going to have one graph which will show the increase in demand, which will come from the increase in income, so a rise in price, rise in quantity, don't forget the axes, and the other graph will show the reduction in supply due to higher production costs, but also disruption due to weather and war. So reduction in quantity here and price on that axis up there. The next question is a comment question, and be very careful, there'll always be 2 comment questions, one around the elasticity and one potentially around supply and demand. So this question says, using figure 1 and information from the passage, comment on whether a rise in the cost of crude oil will always lead, and that's the key part for the evaluation, to companies increasing the retail prices for motorists. It's worth 6 marks, so there will be at least 3 marks for AO4. You're looking for 2 sides here, so the kind of one side is going to be the price of crude oil going up based on, for example, the rise in the supply, and what that will cause is a rise in the cost of production. So this is oil in itself, this is the market for petrol, and that rise in their production costs will just be an automatic result of the cost of the raw material increasing. So the increase in the price of that will increase production costs, that will shift supply, which will then cause the price of petrol to increase. So that's the yes side. On the no side, or the not to the same extent, there is other information in the case study. One of them is that that is only 25% of the total cost of petrol, at which point you could say that then the size of the change is likely to be small, so that potentially this wouldn't shift to the same extent as the shift up here, the price of oil going up by a greater percentage, maybe 10%, and this would only go up 1%. It does also tell you that demand is inelastic, so that essentially the price rise may be at a much greater percentage than the quantity fall. You also have the fact that competition may mean that the price rise is absorbed in profits. So that price rise isn't necessarily passed on to the consumers within that market. You've then got another little section here around consumer surplus. So it says define consumer surplus. The best way to define that is the difference between what a consumer is willing and able to pay above the market price and the market price. The next part, it says, using a diagram, explain what effect a rise in prices will have on consumer surplus. So the diagram will be supply and demand, price will rise, and you just say what effect that will have. So a statement that says that. Okay, so if you're doing consumer surplus, easiest way to do it is just to use demand. Don't put anything on the supply line. Price rise, quantity fall, and as it's saying explain the effect on consumer surplus, the easiest way to do this is to highlight the loss and label the diagram as such. Let's label it up. The next question, E, is looking at elasticities. So we've got a question around elasticities here, and it's looking at price elasticity of demand. It says, line 19 of the article says that world prices are highly price inelastic. Well, it's saying price inelasticity, that's price elasticity of demand. You don't have to define it, but you're going to interpret what price inelastic means. 2 marks, so probably 2 separate bullet points here. Use the word unresponsive. So the quantity demanded for oil is unresponsive to price rises or falls. To add a little bit more, you could just give an example of a 10% rise in price would have the effect of potentially a 5% fall in demand. Then you have a question which is state 2 factors that determine, state and explain, 2 factors that will determine the price elasticity of demand for a product. Be careful that there are key differences between this and the factors that affect demand. So one of the key factors that will affect demand is the number or the amount of substitutes. The price of substitutes affects demand, but the amount of substitutes affects price elasticity of demand. The more substitutes, the more elastic demand will be, and the opposite will be true. So fewer substitutes will equal more inelastic demand. The percentage that this price takes up of someone's income is another factor that will affect it, and if it's a small percentage, then we are inelastic. If it doesn't take up much of our income, we don't really care what happens to the price change. Another one you could do is time. In terms of short term and long term, we tend to be inelastic in the short term and elastic in the longer term, because long term we have the ability to shop around and find cheaper substitutes. So that is the second. Okay, the last question in the elasticities is looking at the comment on the relevance of price elasticities of demand estimates for businesses. If you remember the little mnemonic of don't cry, it's really easy. Define, calculate, interpret, recommend, evaluate. You've just done the interpretation. So if you're looking at the relevance to a business, the relevance is recommending how that business will make profit. So that's the relevance of it. However, what you are really recommending they do is a policy which will increase revenue, and we're assuming that this is going to increase profit. From a comment point of view, as this is two-sided, we also want to look at why maybe it's not relevant or it's not useful for a business to use. In this framework, you can say it depends upon, and then we'll look at a couple of examples of how you could approach that. As it doesn't give any figures, but you are given that petrol is inelastic, then you can use this as the example to evaluate. So price would go down, you would rise prices with an elastic demand. This is because consumers would be unresponsive, and if you rose prices 10%, you'd only lose 5% of your quantity demanded. This would mean that the revenues gained would be greater, and therefore potentially more profits for a business as a result of it. It depends upon, for this, one key thing from A2 is what is happening with costs. So you're assuming that as revenue rises, your costs will either rise at the same percentage or rise at a lower percentage. So from an A2 point of view, you could talk about how you may not gain economies of scale. So actually reducing the amount you produce, because that will be the effect of quantity demanded going down, may take you from a quantity which is your minimum efficient scale to a lower quantity, and this will rise average cost. You could also say it depends upon the competition, because if you raise your prices and they reduce their prices, then they might gain your market share, and actually you don't have inelastic demand, you have elastic demand. So the estimate that you made around inelasticity doesn't hold true because your competitors take advantage of the situation. The last two questions are around market failures. The first one says, environmentalists argue that motorists cause negative externalities. There is a 6-mark question there. Explain why negative externalities arising from increased car use are an example of a market failure. Now, whereas it doesn't ask you to draw the diagram, you could draw the diagram and then explain the recipe to go along with this. So marginal social costs greater than marginal private costs, marginal social benefit, you've got your P and your Q, you've also got your welfare loss to show this here. So you're going to define this as the marginal social cost being greater than the marginal private cost, which causes an external cost which will be paid for by the third party. Now, you can refer to the external cost as being the cost between those 2 points. So if you wanted to add a P2, you could say the external cost paid by the third party from P1 to P2. Give an example here of what the external cost is. So pollution, and you could potentially look at that in terms of the effects on health or the effects on the environment, and the third parties are those that people that don't drive. And if you want, you can refer to the first party as the drivers and the second party as the oil companies providing this. As this price is not paid by the private individuals, then the private cost is less than the social cost, and this means that the market price is too low. This will lead to the overconsumption of fuel at Q1, and this is where you have the loss of allocative efficiency or the misallocation of resources, which is your market failure. A little bit more than you would need for 6 marks there, but you can probably do that quite quickly. Just remember references to the driving or the car market as the key for the EO2 there. So one way you could finish that question off is that there is an overconsumption of cars and there's a misallocation of the scarce resource of oil. The last question is the government intervention question. It's a discuss question. So it's two-sided with an evaluative conclusion, needing key judgment. Whether using indirect taxation is an effective solution. So there we've got our 2 sides. Taxes are effective, taxes are ineffective or less effective to the market failure arising from negative externalities. we've already been told that there is pollution negative externalities in the case study, so it's likely that we would use this as an example. In terms of laying this out, a quick plan, we're going to look at it from a graph point of view. So references to consumer surplus might help here. The graph would just be the tax graph. So rise in production costs to a business, supply shifts left, this rises price, this reduces consumer surplus, this creates a reduction in the quantity demanded to Q1, and if we want to be accurate linked to the question, we could say that that quantity is the socially optimum quantity. We could also potentially use the ad valorem tax graph if you want from A2 and use the graph that we've just drawn for the market failure and analyse it in terms of the private cost equaling the social cost. So we could analyse that in more detail and say that the marginal social cost would equal the marginal private cost, and we've internalised the externality. On the ineffective side, or less effective, a good graph to draw would be the inelastic demand graph and make the demand pretty inelastic. Then what you have is a huge increase in the price of petrol, but an insignificant fall in the quantity, and you could say that that would mean that it wouldn't reach the socially optimum level. What you've also got is a negative on the economy of economic growth being affected in line with that, which it mentions in the case study. So that would be an ineffective use. It's going to damage the economy in other ways, as well as not solving the problem that you've got. You also have the problem of potentially rising incomes, and what that would do is increase the demand. So you may reduce the supply, but at the same time demand might increase, and you might end up back at the quantity which you started. And that is likely because cars are a normal good, which it's linked in, it mentions that in terms of the crude oil being a normal good, so it's likely that the demand for cars would be a normal good as well. One way to look at this, or the best way to evaluate this, is to use some kind of elasticities. If the problem we've got is that it's inelastic, what we're looking for is to try and make demand more elastic. Now, how the taxes are hypothecated will be key. If we provide substitutes, such as buses, and improve the quality and quantity of buses, then what we will do is increase the number of substitutes for cars, which should increase the elasticity of demand, making it more elastic, which would make consumers more responsive and make the tax more effective. We're also providing another alternative which would then not affect economic growth. So consumers would switch from cars to buses, and then they would still satisfy their derived demand for cars and transport, while not polluting to the same extent, because the emissions per kilometre or per person on buses would be a lot lower. You could also look at it from different policies, so potentially looking at regulation as being more effective, because specific quantities can be set. So if you used a quota, then it wouldn't matter if incomes rose, because it wouldn't go beyond the maximum quantity that we'd set for that market.